All right. Well, thank you all for being here today. As you know, I chair the Senate Judiciary Committee, and I founded the Prison Population Task Force to address issues relating to the fact that we have more prisoners committed to the Department of Corrections than we have capacity in the state prison system to hold. Because of that scenario, we have over 500 prisoners committed to the state that are now being housed in county jails around the state. And the long-term trend is going in the wrong direction from a capacity standpoint because, or I should say, not necessarily the wrong direction. The long-term trend is up in terms of commits to the state prison, which means that we have to address the issue one way or another, either finding more space for our prisoners or reducing the population in the state prison. It seemed to me that this was a good opportunity to review the reasons why we have the prisoners in state prison, and the most cost-effective way to address this would be if there are ways to determine that we can release prisoners who are there or reduce the likelihood that people will end up in prison in the first place, or once they're released, reduce the likelihood that they're going to be coming back to prison, then we can all be better off as a society. That would mean that there's less crime. That would mean that there's a more successful reintegration into our communities once people, or offenders, have been released from prison. It would also mean more sensible sentencing. So we convened the task force last fall. We've had meetings over the course of the last 7 months. We gathered a lot of information from experts in the field. We brought in people from across the country, in some instances, to testify before the task force, including a representative from Right on Crime, which demonstrates that this is not a partisan issue. It's not even an ideological or philosophical issue. I think what it says is that there are people thinking across the political spectrum and across the ideological spectrum about how to use our resources most wisely and most efficiently to advance the cause of public safety and fiscal responsibility. The task force was created or made up of basically professionals and experts in the corrections field. It was not a legislatively established task force. It was created just informally by me, and I asked Representative Cornish, my counterpart on the House Committee, to co-chair it with me. And we alternated chairing the task force, and we collaborated on forming the agenda for who would make presentations to the task force. And I think it was a well put together organization that included public defenders, county attorneys, law enforcement, specialists in chemical dependency treatment and mental health. And of course, we had testimony from across the whole range of expertise on that. Across the country, we have seen reforms to the way sentences are happening. This is a national movement. Reforms in particular focusing on the way incarceration is used to promote public safety. And this is happening in both conservative states, progressive states, and at the federal level. The reforms across the country recognized that incarceration is extremely expensive and an inefficient way to keep the public safe, but also often does not serve the purpose of rehabilitating those who have committed crimes. The vast majority of whom, 95% of whom, will eventually return to the communities as our neighbors and in some cases as our family members. Certainly returning to their own families, often as fathers or spouses, significant others, and often, of course, with children in the community. I want to show what's happened in Minnesota. In Minnesota, here's the illustration of the prison population versus our capacity. We have approximately 9,500 spaces in our state prison system, and you can see the projections out to 2022 have us at 10,761 persons committed to the Department of Corrections. That leaves a gap of 1,200 persons. They're going to have to be housed somewhere if we don't take some steps to address this situation. Now, over the past several decades, Minnesota has been a leader in our low incarceration rate. In fact, that's our model. Frankly, it's pretty hard to get yourself committed to state prison. You have to have a pretty hefty criminal history score. You have to commit some pretty serious crimes to get there. Our model has been focusing on community-based corrections and trying to imprison those that most need to be imprisoned. However, in some places, I think we have gone overboard, and the Sentencing Guidelines Commission has recognized that we have gone overboard, particularly in the area of a drug crime. So last year, as you can see here, from the prison population comparison across the country, most states have very low growth in their prison populations. Some states have had a reduction in their prison populations, but Minnesota is an outlier. We have the fifth fastest rate of prison population growth in the country, 31% from 2003 to 2013. The U.S. nationally is at 8%. There are a number of reasons why this has happened, and we've gone into a lot of that in our population task force, but you can see that nationally the rate of crime is down. Total reported crimes, total arrests, court filings, number of adults on probation has all been declining nationally. Yet in Minnesota, our prison population is increasing. We are bucking the trend nationally. Now, this approach that we have in Minnesota is costing our taxpayers millions of dollars. And part of my goal is to find if we are really getting a successful return on our investment for holding people in prison as long as we are, and for the kinds of offenses that we are. And frankly, we're not serving our public well, we're not protecting our communities well, if while persons are in prison, they're not receiving the tools that they're going to need when they're released to be successful when they reintegrate into their communities. Tools such as chemical dependency treatment, mental health treatment, domestic violence treatment, as was raised in the Prison Population Task Force yesterday by the Minnesota Coalition on Battered Women, and job skills and education. And we had lengthy presentation on the impact on recidivism that this kind of training and treatment can have in helping people become safe when they go back into the community and not commit more crimes. So we have this disjunction between the crime rate nationally and the Minnesota prison population, and that overlays, or you might say underlies, the basis for the recommendations that I made to the Prison Task Force yesterday. I want to identify some of those priorities for you again. The focus is on investment while people are in prison in ways that will help them be successful and not commit new crimes when they're released from prison. Investment in mental health treatment. In fact, our prisons have become the single largest institution now warehousing mentally ill persons in Minnesota. Investments in chemical dependency treatment. 85% of our prisoners have some form of drug or alcohol addiction. 25% of men, and it's probably underreported, and 60% of women prisoners need mental health treatment. As was highlighted by the Coalition for Battered Women yesterday, victims of domestic violence want to see our prisoners receive domestic violence treatment as well, anger management counseling and other specific treatment focused on those categories, because as you can imagine, there's often a confluence between the people who have violent tendencies generally and those who engage in domestic violence and chemical dependency treatment. It's all wrapped in together. When you've got an individual that has multiple problems, they're a danger to themselves and, more importantly, to other people. The investments that I propose total only about $7.5 million. That's a small price to pay in comparison to certainly in comparison to the cost of imprisoning more people to reduce recidivism. Now, I want to identify some of the changes relating to drug sentencing that are also part of my proposals. And the best way we can illustrate this is with data that was provided to us by the Minnesota Sentencing Guidelines Commission. They looked at presumptive sentences in comparable states, meaning other states that also have a guidelines structure. Now, the original goal of the guideline structure was to present some consistency between the way people are sentenced across the state and even courtroom to courtroom within counties, so that people who have committed similar offenses and have similar criminal histories will end up serving roughly similar or comparable sentences in prison. What we have found is that the original guidelines that were put together by the Guidelines Commission some 30 years ago overshot the mark, and certainly at present don't reflect either the national trends or the actual sentencing practices in Minnesota courts. You can see here that Minnesota presently has, for a first-degree drug sentence, 0 criminal history score, meaning first-time offender. First-time offender. The presumptive commit is 86 months in prison. 86 months in prison, over 7 years in state prison. The next closest state is Kansas at 49 months. So we are way over even the next closest state. When you look at Washington and Oregon, you're looking at ranges around 16 months, and the federal government is a range of 10 to 16 months. So whenever people talk about, boy, the federal government, they're really tough on all those drug criminals. 10 to 16 months for a first-time offense in a federal sentence for a person who possesses, under current Minnesota law, or current quantities, 25 grams of cocaine or heroin. And then this is the typical first-degree possession. Let's see here. Here's this one is 19 grams of cocaine, and this would be 49 grams of cocaine. And the reason there's a difference, Minnesota has the same sentence for that, but some of the other states go even less when you're dealing with these different offenses. I'm sorry, this is sale and this is possession. So the comparison is what's most important. And what we have found, the Guidelines Commission did a survey. They have all the data, and they determined that the actual sentencing practices in Minnesota are much lower than the guidelines recommend. And that is why they made the changes. We have the collective judgment of 300 judges across Minnesota, almost 300 judges, plus the prosecutors and the defense attorneys in the courtroom. When they all come together on a sentence, or if the judge is the one who makes the decision on his or her own, that they are sentencing much lower than the present guidelines recommend. These are downward departures, either dispositional departures, which means they're getting probation instead of going to prison at all, or durational departures, which means that they are getting shorter sentences in prison than would otherwise be presumed under the guidelines. And what this tells me, and what I think this told the task force in large part, was that our guidelines are not in line with reality. That the judges are looking at the individual circumstances, they're determining what the appropriate punishment should be for an individual person that's convicted of that crime, and they're saying our guidelines are just too long, they'd be going away to prison for too long, and they're sentencing to much lower sentences. The Guidelines Commission recommendations for the changes bring those presumptions in line with the actual practice in our courts. And I, for one, am very willing to rely upon the collective judgment of the judges across the state in making those individualized determinations. What I'm really disappointed in is that the House leadership, including Speaker Dowd and Representative Cornish, who were both identified in recent news reports, have opposed any changes of this nature. They're not willing to go along with the Guidelines Commission. I will note it was a 7-3 vote on the Guidelines Commission, including the 3 judges on the Guidelines Commission, which is led by Associate Justice Chris Dietzen. These are the folks with the expertise in this area. And I think it's valid for us to allow them to do their job. That's what the legislature set them up to do. I want to address also the issue of expansion of prison beds. The governor has, I think, very wisely recommended some investment in expanded prison capacity. And he's done so in a very careful way. The Challenge Incarceration Program is a proven tool for reducing recidivism. It also results in an early release of prisoners who can comply with the vigorous requirements and successfully complete the Challenge Incarceration Program. We don't have enough beds available in the current prison system to have all those who are eligible for the Challenge Incarceration Program go through the program. The governor has recommended expansion, some renovation actually of existing space, some minor expansions in 2 locations, at Togo and at Willow River, to create 70 more beds for the Challenge Incarceration Program. The governor has also recommended expanding some bed space at Lino Lakes, renovating a building that I believe used to be used for a healthcare infirmary. And that would create 65 more beds. I would overlay the governor's recommendation there for those general purpose beds with a suggestion that they be used for chemical dependency treatment, because we also have too few beds in the state prisons for those who need chemical dependency treatment. So I strongly support the governor's recommendations there. Their bonding proposal is $8.5 million worth. And again, a wise expenditure of dollars, and they would create together 135 new beds in the state prison system. What we don't need to do is to buy or lease or contract the facility at Appleton. I think that would be a colossal waste of taxpayer money. One of the things that has troubled me the most is that it is being promoted very heavily by the communities around there as an economic development tool. And their most vociferous selling point has been that we ought to be bringing jobs to their region. Now, I don't begrudge them, and I respect them for advocating for jobs for their region, but we shouldn't allow that to be driving criminal justice policy in Minnesota. We shouldn't decide that we don't need to make changes that would reduce prison capacity because we really want to use the beds up at Appleton that are sitting idle now and create some jobs for Main Street. We should find other ways to create jobs for Main Street. At this point, it's becoming political gamesmanship, and I think it's irresponsible, and frankly, it's damaging to public safety to simply figure that we're going to give up on treating the people that are in prison, or expanding the capacity to do that, and just instead decide to warehouse them in a different location in Minnesota. This is not a short-term option either. Anyone who thinks that once you engage in a lease for a prison facility and you staff up and the local community becomes once again dependent upon the jobs and the income in the area, that you can just very easily decide not to renew the lease or terminate the lease if the demand becomes lower, is fooling themselves. It would become the equivalent of a military base closing once you've invested all of that money in a location and created all the jobs around it. So if the state turns to the Appleton prison to do that, it's not going to be a short-term change. It's going to be a long-term investment in that area, which will be very, very difficult, if not politically impossible, to reverse. And we do have some idea of what the numbers would be, how expensive it would be to do that. First of all, they've got 1,600 beds there available. Even by 2022, we won't have that much of a need. Still, a full 25% of Appleton if we moved all of the new bed space requirements into Appleton, would still be vacant and empty. But you know, the facility is sitting there, first of all, not in the proper configuration for the kind of programs that our Department of Corrections runs. Remember, it was a privately run prison before it became vacant in 2010. And the private prison didn't run the kind of extensive programming that our Department of Corrections runs in our current prisons. So there'd have to be some investment to modify the physical structure there. But secondly, you'd have to staff up and prepare to manage a healthcare facility there, the food services there, all of the other things that go with running an infrastructure, the laundry facility there. You'd be recreating an entire prison community within that facility, and then you'd have to run it. And the estimates are that it could cost around maybe $40 million a year, $30 to $50 million we've heard, so we'll pick $40 million a year to run the Appleton facility and ongoing operational costs, in addition to the cost of a lease. And Corrections Corporation of America, which has given some numbers to the state as a proposed lease in the range of $6 to $8 million a year. So it doesn't take much more than 3 years to run up the cost of building a whole new facility or a big expansion at Rush City, which was originally thought to be a solution, $141 million there. And you've already got all of these infrastructure costs running at Rush City now, the laundry, the food services, and everything else. So you wouldn't have that core investment that would be necessary. You'd have more of an incremental expansion of those services and staffing for that. So if we were going to decide that we need to add bed space, it's much more cost efficient to do it by building onto our existing facilities than it would be to go to Appleton. We have to rehabilitate those who are incarcerated, because as I said, almost all of them will be going back into the community. We can't simply warehouse them. I would rather that they are provided treatment tools, work tools, educational tools to be successful members of our society, and that ultimately will protect the public better than anything else that we can do. Now, I know that in a campaign year, this is not an easy issue, but there is a consensus, as we found yesterday at the task force, on ways to better promote public safety through our system of incarceration. These are the investments that I've recommended in terms of treatment while people are in custody. Indeed, we seem to have found consensus on at least one of the task force, the Guidelines Commission statutory recommendations, which was for first-time offenders who are found with a trace of drugs in their possession, to reduce the criminal level from a felony to a gross misdemeanor. And by the way, I would also support, and I said this yesterday too, I would also encourage the legislature to take the other Guidelines Commission recommendations and implement them. And that includes the kingpin changes that would make much longer sentences, get tougher on crime for those who have very large quantities of drugs in their possession or are selling them. When you get to 50, 100, 150, 500 grams of these drugs in quantities, cocaine for example, there's no way you can use that for personal use. That's clearly distribution, an entrepreneur who's in it to make money. So we ought to do that too. The only way that's going to happen is if we can get rid of some of the political gamesmanship here and move forward with some serious policy making. It's my hope that the members of the legislature will do so. So thank you for your attention. I'm happy to answer any questions that you have.
Senator, how
Yes.
much would you hope to flatten that orange line through your proposals?
Well, altogether, I think my proposals would probably be able to flatten it completely and probably would be able to reduce it down to our to at least close to our existing prison capacity. If you take that in combination with the additional 135 beds proposed by the governor, I think that's doable. There are other options that are on the table as well, that are even more politically challenging. And frankly, I didn't even propose those because I figured they'd be non-starters. Trying to do something that's actually accomplishable.
The reason I ask is you mentioned that a number of judges around the state believe that the sentences are too harsh in some cases. So I assume that there is perhaps, that they're departing as much as they can downward, and I assume there may be some plea bargains involved in this whole process. So are you really going to get as much reduction as you think, or have you factored that into your calculations?
Well, you know, we're not proposing to change sentencing practices, and the Guidelines Commission's changes that are proposed that will take effect August 1. You know, as a practical matter, you're right, they probably won't have much of an impact directly on the beds. And in fact, some of the proposals, the Kingpin proposals, would actually have a different impact to keep people in longer. So those really aren't the big ones. The big ones would be the reduction in recidivism that would result from some of these additional investments in treatment and so on. And part of my proposals yesterday also included expanded capacity for our community corrections officials, probation officers basically, and the ones who are supervising the release on behalf of the Department of Corrections, so that they're in a better position to work with their clients, with the offenders who are released back into the community, and help to reduce the likelihood that those persons are going to reoffend or are going to commit more technical violations of the conditions of the release. 2,700 people in our current prisons are those who are back on release violations. So if we can reduce the release violations, we can have a big impact on them.
Senator Latz, you pre-acted to most of the challenges I was going to raise, that, you know, this being an election year. Can you address that, along with the fact there truly is some momentum behind Appleton on the other side of the aisle?
Well, yeah, you know, it is an election year, and the problem is these are very easy issues to demagogue, which is to say it's good campaign fodder. Even if you had a vote on a comprehensive package that included some get tough on crime provisions and some get smarter on crime provisions, it doesn't take much creativity to pull out only the parts that could be characterized as being soft on crime and just isolating that in a campaign piece. So I get the politics of it. That would be very difficult.
Is it impossible this year with both chambers up?
It might be. It might be impossible this year. And part of what we're doing is we have to lay a groundwork, lay a base, as they say, for changes that sometimes take a few years for people to get comfortable with and to recognize the value of. Now, as to the momentum that Appleton may have, you know, I guess it doesn't surprise me that there is support for privatizing.
If I might add.
No, there's some support in my caucus for that. I don't think there's, at least within my caucus, I don't see the support at all relating to privatization of running the prison. In the House, I think, especially in the majority caucus there, I think there's more support just for privatizing the whole thing too. And there's a lot of statistics nationally that would call into question you know, how intelligent it would be to privatize prisons, just in terms of injuries that they have in there, staffing levels they have in there, problems with transportation between facilities and so on.
But House and House leadership has been talking about this quite a bit in the last couple of weeks. I mean, couldn't this be one of those things that gets thrown in when three guys go in a room and cut the deal at the end of session?
I would sure hope not. I will fight it very hard because I just don't think it's very smart. You know, the worst thing that we could do, as I said before, is to allow economic development needs to drive criminal justice policy. And it's the tail wagging the dog. I mean, who wants to be incarcerated? Or does it even make moral sense for us to incarcerate people that may not need to be incarcerated just for the jobs that they'll create in greater Minnesota? And if you look at the website for the Appleton advocates, the first things that are up there, most of the website is all about economic development and the jobs it's going to create.
And that's why it was created to begin with.
Well, you know, the city of Appleton took a flyer on that, and you know, we can debate, you know, past decisions whether it was wise for them to make the kind of investment that they did as an economic development tool, but it was done at a time when nationally the prison population was increasing. When, the war on drugs was going on, the federal prison population was dramatically increasing, and, they had a lot of federal prisoners there. The national trend now is going the opposite direction.
Can you talk more about that context? Sorry, if I can just follow up on that one. Can you talk more about that context of war on drugs? Is this really the 1990s war on drugs now coming back to bite us?
I think so. I think we overreacted then. I think, it's very easy to ratchet up criminal penalties politically. Everyone wants to say that they're being tough on crime, and they voted to put the bad guys away, and that's what happened. And there was a thought at the time also that was going to have the impact that was desired, was to keep drugs out of our communities if we just locked everyone up who was using drugs or especially those who were dealing drugs. But the effect has been to lock up a lot of people who are addicts. Not so much dealers, but addicts who have a medical condition. It's a wicked addiction. Anyone who's been around the court system or around the individuals who are in the court system with these kind of criminal charges understand how vicious these addictions are. So instead of putting them in the hospital or in treatment, we've put them in prison. And it hasn't been effective. We still have lots of drugs out in our community. I mean, you look around now, the meth in Minnesota is at epidemic levels. And we haven't stopped that by incarcerating more people in Minnesota. It's still coming in. As long as there's a demand, the supply is going to find its way to those persons.
Now, you mentioned you don't want to change the guidelines for sentencing. Do you want the judges to use, well, what do you want to happen then?
Now, I don't want to change the recommendations that the Guidelines Commission have made, which will become effective August 1st. Under the way the legislature set up the Guidelines Commission was to establish this broad base of experts in sentencing issues and delegate to them some responsibility or authority to make judgments on behalf of the legislature as to what appropriate sentences should look like. The legislature establishes the maximum penalty for the crimes in statute. We establish the different degrees. And then we tell the experts to decide what they think the presumptive sentences ought to look like. And that happened 30 years ago. But times have changed, and we've recognized a difference under the current guidelines grid. The judges are collectively deciding the current guidelines grid doesn't work. It doesn't make any sense when you apply it to individual situations in front of them for sentencing.
Is it safe to say it's too harsh?
Yeah, it's absolutely too harsh. And the judges have been saying that for years now. So the Guidelines Commission has made a decision that they're going to adjust the grid to reflect the way judges are now currently sentencing. I do not want to change the Guidelines decision, a Commission's decision on that. I would like those changes to take effect August 1st. And I'm very firm in my commitment. And frankly, I will let the rest of my agenda in this area not be enacted if that's what it takes to allow the Guidelines Commission changes to go into effect.
If the guidelines are changed, and can anything happen retroactively then to people that are currently incarcerated, or do they have to finish up their sentences as sentenced previously?
Yeah, retroactive application would require a new statute to do that. We'd have to pass a law to allow that.
Okay.
All right. Thank you very much.